In the heart of Central Africa lies a country often referred to as the land of 1,000 hills. Rwanda, lush and green, is a nation whose beauty belies the horrors that unfolded on its soil in 1994. For 100 days, the world watched, or rather looked away, as nearly 1 million men, women and children were slaughtered in one of the most brutal genocides of the 20th century. The machete became the weapon of choice. The radio became an instrument of death. And the international community, equipped with intelligence resources and moral obligations, stood paralyzed. Or worse, willfully indifferent. But to understand the genocide that tore Rwanda apart, we must begin long before the killing began. Long before the Interahamwe militia. Long before Hutu power radio broadcasts. Long before April 6, 1994. The story begins in the late 19th century, when European colonialism began carving up Africa like a cake on a map drawn by outsiders. Rwanda was first colonized by Germany in the 1890s. After World War I, Belgium took control under a League of Nations mandate. It was during the Belgian administration that one of the most insidious elements of the genocide was first codified identity. The Belgians, under a policy of indirect rule, chose to govern through Rwanda's traditional monarchy and aristocracy. But they didn't stop there. Influenced by racist anthropological theories, they divided Rwanda's population into ethnic categories, primarily Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa. Despite these groups having long coexisted, intermarried, and shared language and culture, the Tutsis, often taller and more aristocratic in appearance, were favored by the colonial administration. They were given education, administrative roles, and power. Hutus, the majority population, were relegated to subsistence farming and the lower rungs of society. The Belgians even issued identity cards labeling citizens by ethnicity, institutionalizing a division that had never before been rigid. This racialized favoritism bred resentment. Hutu nationalist sentiments simmered beneath the surface. When Rwanda moved toward independence in the late 1950s, the power dynamics began to shift. The Belgians, sensing the winds of change, flipped their support to the Hutu majority. What followed was a wave of violence and retribution. Thousands of Tutsis were killed or forced into exile in neighboring countries. A young generation of Tutsi refugees grew up in Uganda, Burundi, Tanzania, and Zaire, many of them carrying the trauma of displacement and a deep yearning to return. In 1962, Rwanda gained independence. The new Hutu-led government promised stability, but delivered ethnic repression. Over the next 3 decades, waves of anti-Tutsi violence erupted periodically, each time pushing more people into exile. The ruling regimes became increasingly authoritarian, stoking ethnic fear and weaponizing historical grievances. Meanwhile, the world paid little attention. In 1987, a group of Tutsi exiles and their children, many of whom had served in the Ugandan army under Yoweri Museveni, formed the Rwandan Patriotic Front (RPF). Their aim to return to Rwanda and reclaim their homeland. In October 1990, the RPF launched a military incursion from Uganda into northern Rwanda. The Rwandan government, led by President Juvenal Habyarimana, responded with force. The civil war had begun. But this wasn't just a conflict of guns and borders. It was a war of propaganda, ideology, and fear. Habyarimana's regime, backed by France and supported, if quietly, by elements in the international community, used the RPF threat to paint all Tutsis as traitors and invaders. Extremist elements within the government began building a parallel power structure, one that would not just fight the RPF, but prepare for something far more sinister. Lists were drawn, militias trained, arms were stockpiled, and yet peace was the official narrative. In 1993, under international pressure, Habyarimana signed the Arusha Accords, a power-sharing agreement with the RPF. The accords were hailed by Western diplomats as a triumph of diplomacy. The United Nations sent in a small peacekeeping force, UNAMIR, led by Canadian General Romeo Dallaire. But it was underfunded, undermanned, and given a mandate that prohibited proactive engagement. Behind the scenes, the machinery of genocide was already in motion. The extremist radio station RTLM began broadcasting venomous anti-Tutsi propaganda. Tutsis were dehumanized, referred to as cockroaches. Militias like the Interahamwe were organized under the guise of youth movements trained not in civic duty, but in the logistics of slaughter. The French government, fearing the rise of Anglo-influenced RPF forces, continued to arm and train Habyarimana's army, despite growing evidence of human rights abuses. Western intelligence agencies knew what was coming. In January 1994, General Dallaire sent a now infamous cable to UN headquarters warning of a planned genocide. He requested authorization to seize weapons caches and protect civilians. The UN denied the request. Then, on April 6, 1994, the plane carrying President Habyarimana was shot down as it approached Kigali airport. To this day, the perpetrators remain unidentified. Some blame the RPF, others say it was Hutu extremists opposed to the peace deal. Regardless, within hours of the crash, roadblocks appeared across Kigali. The killing began immediately. But this wasn't a spontaneous outbreak of violence. It was a coordinated, pre-planned extermination campaign. Government forces, militias, and ordinary civilians were mobilized to kill their neighbors. Churches became slaughterhouses. Schools turned into execution grounds. Tutsis were hunted with a brutality that shocked even the most hardened UN personnel. And the world did nothing. April 7, 1994. The morning after the presidential plane fell from the Rwandan sky, Kigali erupted not into chaos but into a calculated purge. This was not war. It was genocide. A methodical, state-orchestrated attempt to eliminate the Tutsi population, men, women, children, infants with machetes, clubs and bullets. Entire families were erased in minutes. Neighbors turned on neighbors. The Hutu power movement, long prepared for this moment, unleashed the Interahamwe militias in a frenzy of blood and fire. What followed was 100 days of terror, so swift and so complete that it nearly wiped an ethnic group off the map. But this part of the story is already known, at least in its outlines. What is less discussed and more haunting is how much the rest of the world saw and did not stop. At United Nations headquarters in New York, General Romeo Dallaire's desperate messages from Kigali became increasingly urgent. He and his UNAMIR peacekeepers had already witnessed the beginnings of the slaughter. Government soldiers were executing Tutsis in the streets. Roadblocks were manned by militias armed with guns and machetes. Civilians were dragged from buses and killed on the spot. The Interahamwe were moving with horrifying efficiency, but the peacekeepers were under strict orders: no engagement, no intervention. The United Nations Security Council, led by the United States, did not act. Worse, on April 21st, just weeks into the genocide, they voted to reduce the already small UNAMIR force from 2,500 troops to a skeleton crew of 270. The message was unmistakable: the Rwandan people were on their own. In Washington, President Bill Clinton and his advisors carefully avoided using the word genocide. To do so, under the 1948 Genocide Convention, would legally obligate the US to act. Instead, officials referred to the events as acts of genocide, hedging language, even as satellite imagery and diplomatic cables confirmed the scale of the killing. Later interviews and documents would reveal just how much the US administration knew. National Security Council minutes showed that intelligence analysts had a clear picture of what was unfolding. They knew the Interahamwe were targeting Tutsis. They knew the killings were systematic. And still, the Clinton administration chose not to intervene politically, unwilling to risk another Somalia-style disaster, still haunted by the deaths of American soldiers in Mogadishu just months earlier. The French government, meanwhile, had deeper entanglements. France had long supported the Habyarimana regime, seeing Rwanda as part of its Francophone Africa sphere of influence. Even as the killings intensified, French officials resisted calls to condemn the regime. Instead, they launched Operation Turquoise, a military mission under the guise of humanitarian intervention. It created a safe zone in western Rwanda, but critics argue it also served as a corridor for genocidaires to escape into Zaire. Among them were high-ranking officials and militia leaders responsible for orchestrating the genocide. France has never fully accounted for its role. A 2021 report commissioned by the French government admitted to serious and overwhelming responsibility, but stopped short of calling it complicity. Survivors and scholars disagree. Belgium, too, had its own reckoning. When 10 Belgian UN peacekeepers were brutally tortured and killed by Rwandan soldiers in the early days of the genocide, the Belgian government pulled its remaining forces out of Rwanda entirely. It was a decision born of national trauma, but it also removed one of the few contingents willing and able to intervene. In pulling out Belgium, helped signal to the genocidaires that no one would stop them. Meanwhile, on the ground, the machinery of death continued. Churches, once sanctuaries, became slaughterhouses. Priests and nuns were among the perpetrators. International NGOs, overwhelmed and under attack, were forced to evacuate. Hospitals were stormed. Patients were executed in their beds. Schools were turned into traps. Children who had once played together were taught to see each other as enemies. Teachers became executioners. And through it all, the Rwandan Patriotic Front advanced. Paul Kagame, commanding the RPF from the north, pushed steadily toward Kigali. His troops, disciplined, highly trained, and driven by a mission to stop the genocide, faced stiff resistance. Government forces, aided by militias, used civilians as human shields. Refugee camps were bombed, villages were razed, but the RPF moved forward. By July 1994, they had captured Kigali. The genocidal government fled into Zaire, taking hundreds of thousands of Hutu civilians with them, some willingly, others at gunpoint. Among them were the architects of the genocide, now hidden among the masses in makeshift refugee camps near Goma. These camps, funded and supplied by international aid, became rear bases for Hutu militias planning a return to power. The genocide had ended, but the aftermath would spark another crisis, one that would engulf Central Africa in bloodshed for years to come. And still, even as the scale of the horror became undeniable, skulls stacked like firewood mass graves, unearthed by the thousands, the world struggled to grasp what had happened. The international community pledged never again, once more. Apologies were issued. Reports were commissioned. Truths were acknowledged, but too late for the million who had died. In the immediate aftermath of the genocide, the world confronted a grim accounting of lives lost and lives shattered. But behind the tears of regret and the vows of never again lay another more uncomfortable reckoning, one that pulled back the curtain on how Western powers knowingly or unknowingly helped set the stage for Rwanda's collapse. This was not simply a matter of inaction, it was a matter of decision-making. Choices made in diplomatic back rooms, intelligence offices, and corporate boardrooms shaped the conditions that allowed genocide to unfold unchecked. Let us start with the most basic truth: the genocide did not occur in a vacuum. Rwanda, though small and often dismissed as geopolitically insignificant, sat at the nexus of powerful interests. France, seeking to preserve its post-colonial influence in Francophone Africa, had developed deep ties with President Habyarimana's regime. It provided not only military training and weapons, but also diplomatic cover at the highest levels. In the years leading up to the genocide, French soldiers trained elite units of the Rwandan armed forces, some of the very same units that later helped coordinate the extermination campaign. But France's support extended beyond mere defense cooperation. It was ideological. French leaders viewed the RPF, whose leadership included Tutsi exiles trained in Anglophone Uganda, as a proxy for Anglo-American influence. The fear of losing Rwanda to an English-speaking RPF-led government spurred France to double down on its support for the existing regime, even as its repression grew more violent. French military advisors remained embedded with government troops well into 1994. Some would later testify that they were aware of ethnic cleansing operations, yet did nothing to stop them. Then came Operation Turquoise, France's last-minute military intervention launched in June 1994 under a UN mandate. Publicly, it was a humanitarian mission. Privately, it served another function, creating a safe corridor for the retreating Hutu power elite. In the so-called Zone Turquoise, French troops provided cover for the fleeing genocidaires. The irony was, bitter soldiers sent to protect civilians were in effect sheltering the architects of genocide. But France was not alone in this quiet complicity. The United States, though less directly involved in Rwanda's internal affairs, played a pivotal role in shaping the international response or lack thereof. After the debacle in Somalia, where American soldiers were killed in a mission gone awry, the Clinton administration was deeply reluctant to engage in any African conflict. This was not merely political cowardice, it was policy. Documents declassified years later revealed that US officials made a calculated choice to avoid intervention. A secret Pentagon memo listed possible responses to the genocide, dismissing most as too costly or too risky. Even proposals to jam RTLM, the hate radio station inciting killings, were rejected as too expensive despite estimates showing it could have been done for a few $1,000s. The State Department deliberately avoided using the term genocide in public statements. Internal memos show that staff were instructed to dance around the term for fear it would trigger obligations under the Genocide Convention. The objective was clear: limit public pressure, avoid legal commitments, and keep Rwanda off the front page. Meanwhile, international institutions like the UN were hamstrung by bureaucracy and politics. The Security Council, under pressure from powerful member states, refused to grant UNAMIR a stronger mandate. Peacekeepers who remained in Rwanda were ordered not to intervene, even when they witnessed massacres firsthand. Soldiers stood guard outside churches, while civilians inside were slaughtered. The UN's failure wasn't just institutional, it was moral. And then there was the role of the aid industry, those NGOs, charities, and UN agencies that flooded into Rwanda and Zaire after the genocide ended. While their work saved lives, it also enabled a dangerous dynamic. Refugee camps in eastern Zaire became safe havens for the defeated Rwandan regime. Militias rearmed under the cover of humanitarian aid. Convoys meant to deliver food and medicine were hijacked to resupply killers. The international community, eager to show compassion, ended up stabilizing the very forces that had committed mass murder. Western media, too, bore responsibility. In the early weeks of the genocide, coverage was sparse, confused, and often framed through a lens of tribal violence, a euphemism that obscured the political and ideological dimensions of the killings. By portraying the conflict as ancient and irrational, the press reinforced the notion that nothing could be done, that Africa was simply a place of chaos and bloodshed. That intervention was futile. In reality, the genocide was organized, modern, and deeply political. It was the product of calculated planning, radio propaganda, government coordination, and international neglect. And in many ways, it was enabled by a global system that valued strategic alliances over human life. But perhaps the most chilling element of Western complicity lies in what came after. As the dust settled and the RPF took control of Rwanda, the West rushed to rehabilitate its image. Aid flowed into the new government. Leaders who had once armed the perpetrators now posed for photos with survivors. Conferences were held. Reports were published. Regret was expressed, but accountability that remained elusive. France resisted calls for a full investigation. The United States offered apologies but avoided legal or financial reparations. The United Nations reformed some internal processes, but many of the same structures remained in place. The survivors of the genocide, meanwhile, faced a new struggle, rebuilding their lives in a country scarred by unimaginable trauma. July 1994. Kigali lay in ruins. The bodies were still being buried, the air still thick with the stench of death, and the world had finally turned its gaze to Rwanda, but only after nearly 1 million lives had been erased. The genocide was over, but its consequences were only just beginning. And for the survivors, the reckoning would stretch not for weeks, months, or years, but for generations. Paul Kagame's Rwandan Patriotic Front had taken control of the country, effectively ending the genocide. But their victory was not just a military one. It was moral, symbolic, an end to a century of colonial favoritism, forced exile, and orchestrated repression. The RPF inherited a country decimated by hate, stripped of infrastructure, and haunted by silence. Over 120,000 people were in prison, suspected of participating in the genocide. Hundreds of thousands of Hutus had fled to Zaire, fearing reprisals. Many of them were civilians, but among them hid the masterminds of the genocide, now regrouping in the dense forests of eastern Congo, preparing for vengeance. The world's attention, momentarily fixated on Rwanda, now shifted. Cameras moved on. Headlines faded. But Kagame's new government, seeking both justice and stability, faced a Herculean task: how to reconcile a nation divided by trauma. How to judge crimes of such magnitude without destroying the fragile peace that remained. Rwanda's judicial system was shattered, so the government turned to an ancient local tradition, Gacaca courts. These community-based tribunals brought genocide suspects before their neighbors, not in the pursuit of perfect justice, but of catharsis. Over 1 million cases would be heard across the country. Confessions were encouraged. Forgiveness was sometimes granted. Truth-telling became a kind of national therapy. But Gacaca was not without criticism. It lacked legal safeguards. Innocents were sometimes punished. And while it processed vast numbers of perpetrators, it was not designed to judge those outside Rwanda's borders who had played a role in enabling the genocide. For that, the world turned to the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda ICTR, based in Arusha, Tanzania. Established by the UN in late 1994, the tribunal sought to prosecute high-level organizers of the genocide. Over 2 decades, it indicted 93 individuals, government ministers, military commanders, propagandists, like the founders of RTLM Radio. Some were convicted. Others died in exile. A few still walk free today. But notably absent from the dock were those in the West who had supported the genocidal regime, supplied weapons, or obstructed UN action. No French officials were tried. No American diplomats were subpoenaed. No arms dealers faced reckoning for shipments delivered even as the killing intensified. The tribunal delivered justice, but only within a narrow frame. Meanwhile, the genocide's ripple effect was reshaping an entire region. In Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, refugee camps became staging grounds for a new conflict. Kagame's government, rightly concerned about the threat posed by Hutu militias hiding among civilians, launched a cross-border offensive. What followed was the First Congo War, a brutal campaign that toppled Mobutu Sese Seko's regime, but plunged the region into further instability. The Second Congo War soon followed a conflict that would involve 9 African nations, multiple armed groups, and leave over 5 million dead. It was the deadliest war since World War II, and it had its roots in the unfinished business of Rwanda. Today, Rwanda is often praised for its recovery. Kigali is clean, safe, and orderly. Poverty has declined. Women hold a majority in parliament. The government has invested in health, education, and reconciliation. But this success has come at a cost. Paul Kagame, now president, rules with a firm hand. Political opposition is tightly controlled. Critics have been jailed, exiled, and in some cases found dead abroad. Freedom of the press is limited. The same government that saved Rwanda from genocide is now accused by some of wielding power through fear and control. Western nations, eager to support a model African success story, have largely looked the other way. Billions in aid have poured into Rwanda. Kagame is welcomed in Washington, Paris, and London. His government is celebrated at development conferences. But human rights organizations warn that too much praise risks masking abuses and repeating the very silence that once enabled genocide. The genocide also reshaped global norms. The phrase responsibility to protect R2P entered the international vocabulary, an attempt to codify the idea that sovereignty cannot shield mass murder. But R2P has proved more aspirational than enforceable. It was invoked in Libya, ignored in Syria, and debated endlessly in conflicts from Myanmar to Ethiopia. The legacy of Rwanda, rather than producing a new era of intervention, may have instead hardened the world's reluctance to act, fearing quagmires, accusations of neocolonialism or political fallout. And so we are left with a chilling paradox. Rwanda taught the world what genocide looks like in real time. It showed us how propaganda, fear, and bureaucracy can become tools of extermination. It revealed how international institutions can fail, not through ignorance, but through calculation. Yet still the world has not truly changed. In Bosnia, Darfur, Myanmar, Gaza, and beyond, the patterns repeat. Dehumanization, silence, denial, and then too late acknowledgement, always too late. What the Rwanda genocide demands of us is not just memory, but vigilance. Not just mourning, but action. The question is not whether we remember 1994. The question is whether we recognize 1994 when it happens again, shrouded in new names, new languages, and new excuses. And what of the Western complicity? It remains largely unpunished, unspoken, unresolved, because to acknowledge it fully would mean facing an uncomfortable truth that the world did not fail Rwanda. The world chose to let Rwanda die. And that choice, made behind closed doors, in polished offices, in quiet conversations, echoes louder than any machete ever could.